Hello, and welcome back to the Crime Folio. Thank you for joining us as we explore the dark corridors where human emotion festers into criminal intent. Most violent acts are born of sudden passion, a fleeting moment of rage. But there is another kind of violence, one that is not born in heat, but cultivated in cold. It is a vengeance that lies dormant, nurtured by memory and resentment over years, even decades. The final act is not a chaotic explosion, but a meticulously planned execution, a plot where every detail is a testament to a grudge that time could not erase. Case 1. The Bath School Massacre's Bitter Harvest. A town treasurer, ruined and resentful, enacts a devastating revenge on his community. The story of a grudge often begins with a perceived slight, a wound to pride or property that is allowed to fester in the darkness of a single mind. In the small, unassuming farming community of Bath Township, Michigan, in the 1920s, such a grudge took root in the heart of a man the town had once trusted. It was a grudge that would be nurtured for years, cultivated with a chilling, methodical patience, and would ultimately blossom into one of the most horrific acts of mass murder in American history. The town of Bath in the 1920s was a picture of modest, heartland progress. Its greatest source of civic pride was the new consolidated school building, a modern brick structure that had replaced the scattered, one-room schoolhouses of the past. It was a symbol of the community's investment in its future, a testament to its belief in education and progress. But progress comes at a cost. To fund the new school, the township had levied a new property tax, a burden that fell heavily on the local farmers. For most, it was a necessary price to pay for their children's future. For one man, it was a personal and unforgivable insult. That man was Andrew Kehoe. Kehoe was a man of some standing in the community. He was a farmer, an engineer by trade, and had served for a time on the school board as its treasurer. He was known for his intelligence, his mechanical aptitude, and his almost pathological frugality. He was also known for his rigid, unforgiving nature and a temper that could flare with sudden, violent intensity. He was a man who did not suffer fools, and in his mind, the world was increasingly full of them. The new school tax became the focal point of Kehoe's simmering rage. He argued against it publicly, his voice one of bitter dissent. He saw it not as a community investment, but as a personal financial attack, a punishment for his own thrift and hard work. His resentment deepened in 1926 when he was defeated in an election for the position of township clerk. The loss was a public humiliation, a rejection by the very community he felt was already bankrupting him. The final blow came when his farm, struggling under the weight of the new taxes, faced foreclosure. Andrew Kehoe, the proud, intelligent man, the former treasurer, was a failure. In the quiet of his farm, his public grievances curdled into a secret, homicidal obsession. He identified the source of all his problems, the school. It was the symbol of the taxes that had ruined him, the progressive ideas he despised, and the community that had, in his mind, betrayed him. He decided that the community would pay for his humiliation, and he would make them pay through their most precious asset, their children. The plot that Andrew Kehoe conceived was not one of impulsive violence. It was a work of meticulous, long-term engineering. He was an expert in explosives, having used them for demolition and farming. Over a period of nearly a year, he began to acquire, by his own account, more than a ton of pyritol, a highly volatile incendiary explosive that had been sold cheaply to farmers for land clearing after World War I. He also amassed hundreds of pounds of dynamite. His position as a former board member and his reputation as a skilled handyman gave him unfettered access to the school building. During the summer and fall of 1926, under the guise of performing free electrical repairs, he began his secret work. He spent countless hours in the crawlspace beneath the school, methodically wiring the entire north and south wings of the building with his explosives. He connected the charges to a detonating clock, a grim, homemade alarm set to go off at a specific, terrible moment. His neighbors saw a man dedicated to his community. They did not see the architect of its destruction. As the date of his planned revenge drew near, Kehoe's actions became more deliberate and final. He stopped working his farm. He told a neighbor that his horses were lazy, and then he beat one of them to death. In the weeks leading up to the massacre, he methodically killed his remaining livestock. He also murdered his wife, Edith. Edith had been suffering from a long illness, likely tuberculosis, and in Kehoe's twisted logic, her death was a mercy, a sparing from the shame and financial ruin he felt. He placed her body in a wheelbarrow in a shed behind the farmhouse. On the morning of May 18, 1927, Andrew Kehoe began the final act of his long-nurtured grudge. He set a series of incendiary devices on timers around his own farm. The house, the barn, and the outbuildings were all wired to explode. He then took a sign he had carefully painted and attached it to a fence facing the road. It read, in stark block letters, "Criminals are made, not born." It was his manifesto, his final, bitter word to a world he was about to leave. At approximately 8:45 a.m., as the children of Bath were settling into their classrooms, Kehoe's meticulously planned hell was unleashed. The first explosion was at his farm. The buildings erupted in a fireball, the controlled demolition of his own life. But this was merely a prelude. At that exact moment, the detonating clock in the school basement completed its circuit. A massive explosion tore through the north wing of the Bath Consolidated School. The building seemed to lift from its foundations before collapsing into a twisted heap of brick, timber, and plaster. The sound was heard for miles. The blast was so powerful it shattered windows in the town's main street. The scene was one of almost unimaginable horror. The north wing had been obliterated. Children were buried under tons of debris. The air was filled with dust and the screams of the injured and dying. Parents and townspeople, hearing the blast, rushed to the school. They arrived to a scene of carnage, a battlefield where their own children were the casualties. They began digging with their bare hands, frantic to reach the small bodies trapped beneath the wreckage. But Andrew Kehoe's revenge was not yet complete. About half an hour after the initial explosion, as the rescue efforts were in full, chaotic swing, Kehoe himself drove up to the school in his Ford truck. He saw the devastation he had wrought. He saw the parents weeping over the bodies of their children. He saw the school's superintendent, Emory Hike, a man he personally blamed for his financial troubles. Kehoe called Hike over to his truck. As the superintendent approached, Kehoe raised a rifle and fired into the back of his truck. The truck was not carrying rescue equipment. It was packed with dynamite and hundreds of pounds of metal shrapnel nails, bolts, and scrap iron. The rifle shot detonated the mobile bomb. The resulting explosion was catastrophic. It killed Kehoe instantly. It killed Superintendent Hike. It killed the postmaster. And it killed several other bystanders, including a young boy who had survived the first blast only to be killed by the second. Andrew Kehoe's final act was one of personal, face-to-face annihilation. In the aftermath, the town of Bath was a community destroyed. In total, 44 people were killed, 38 of them children. Another 58 were injured. It remains the deadliest act of school violence in American history. As rescuers continued their grim work in the rubble, they made a final, chilling discovery. The south wing of the school had not exploded. They found the wiring, and they found the source. Over 500 pounds of unexploded dynamite and pyritol. A simple fault in Kehoe's wiring had prevented the death toll from being more than double what it was. His plan had been to destroy the entire school, to kill every single person inside it. The story of the Bath School Massacre is the ultimate tale of a grudge that metastasized into pure evil. Andrew Kehoe was not insane in a way that rendered him incapable of understanding his actions. He was a man of high intelligence and meticulous planning. His revenge was not a sudden, passionate outburst. It was a cold, calculated, and patiently executed plot. He felt the world had wronged him, and he responded by declaring war on its future. He targeted the children, the ultimate symbol of innocence and community, to inflict a wound so deep that the town of Bath would never fully recover. His crudely painted sign was his only explanation, the final, bitter harvest of a grudge held for years. Case 2. The Pharmacist's 12-Year Mail Bomb. A disgraced pharmacist mails a bomb to the official who ruined his career years earlier. A grudge, by its nature, is an act of memory. It is the careful preservation of a past wrong, a wound that is kept open, not allowed to heal. For most, this memory fades over time, its sharp edges softened by the daily demands of life. But for some, the memory does not fade, it refines. It becomes a focal point, a single, dark star around which their entire existence orbits. This is the story of a man whose professional life was ended by a single decision and who, for 12 long years, nurtured his resentment until it was ready to be mailed, a cold-blooded and explosive act of revenge delivered by the postman. The story begins in the 1970s in the state of Maryland. Walter Leroy Moody Jr. was a man of intelligence and ambition, but also one of profound and difficult personality. He had served in the military and had trained as a lab technician. But his true passion seemed to be a kind of amateur legal scholarship. He was a man obsessed with the law, with procedure, and with his own perceived rights. In 1972, this obsession collided with his professional life in a catastrophic way. Moody was a passenger in a car when a pipe bomb he was carrying exploded prematurely, injuring him. An investigation revealed that the bomb was intended for a car dealer who had repossessed Moody's vehicle. He was arrested, charged, and convicted of possessing the bomb. He served 3 years in federal prison. Upon his release, Moody attempted to put his life back together. He went back to school, earning a law degree, though he was never able to pass the bar exam. He worked various jobs, but his life was defined by a simmering, constant anger. He saw himself as a victim of the system, a man whose life had been unfairly derailed. The target of his deepest, most enduring resentment was not a person, but an institution, the American justice system, and the grudge that would define his life began to take shape. He believed his 1972 conviction was a miscarriage of justice. He filed endless appeals, becoming a self-taught expert in the minutiae of his own case. He wrote letters to judges, to lawyers, to anyone he thought could help him overturn the conviction that he saw as a permanent stain on his record. In the mid-1980s, his path crossed with that of Judge Robert S. Vance. Vance was a respected and liberal-minded judge on the 11th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. Moody's appeal of his 1972 conviction came before a panel of judges that included Vance. The panel upheld the conviction. For the court, it was a routine decision, one of thousands they made. For Walter Moody, it was the final, unforgivable betrayal. He now had a face for his anger. He had a specific target for his rage. The name Robert S. Vance became etched in his mind. But Moody's revenge was not impulsive. It was patient. He began to plan, his legal knowledge now twisted into the service of a new, darker purpose. He studied the methods of previous mail bombers. He learned about forensic science, about how to construct a bomb that would be difficult to trace. He understood that to get away with his crime, he had to create a narrative, a smokescreen that would point the investigators in the wrong direction. He decided his revenge would not be a singular act. It would be part of a larger campaign, a supposed war waged against the justice system by a shadowy, racist organization. This would be his misdirection. For 12 years after the court's decision, the grudge simmered. Walter Moody lived a quiet, unassuming life in rural Georgia. He worked as a handyman, a man who kept to himself. No one knew that in his small workshop, he was slowly, methodically constructing the instruments of his revenge. He built 4 intricate and deadly pipe bombs. They were designed with a cruel precision. They were packed with nails and screws to act as shrapnel. He designed a trigger mechanism that was almost guaranteed to detonate when the package was opened. And he took meticulous care to ensure that the bombs contained no fingerprints, no DNA, no clue that could lead back to him. In December of 1989, 12 years after his conviction was upheld, Walter Moody was ready. He mailed his packages of death. The first bomb was sent to the home of Judge Robert S. Vance in Mountain Brook, a quiet suburb of Birmingham, Alabama. On December 16, 1989, Judge Vance picked up the package from his kitchen counter. It was a cardboard box, wrapped in brown paper. As he opened it, the bomb exploded with devastating force. Judge Vance was killed instantly. His wife, Helen, was severely injured but survived. The assassination of a federal judge was a shocking and terrifying event, an attack on the very heart of the American legal system. The second bomb arrived 2 days later at the office of Robert E. Robinson, a civil rights attorney in Savannah, Georgia. Robinson, like Judge Vance, was killed instantly when he opened the package. The 2 murders, one of a white federal judge, the other of a black civil rights lawyer, seemed to confirm the narrative that Moody had so carefully constructed. The media and the initial investigation focused on the theory of a racially motivated attack, possibly by a white supremacist group like the Ku Klux Klan. Letters were sent to news organizations and to the court, claiming responsibility for the bombings on behalf of a group calling itself Americans for a Competent Federal Judicial System. The letters contained racist language and threats of further violence. The smokescreen was working perfectly. 2 other bombs were mailed but were discovered and disarmed before they could kill. One was sent to the 11th Circuit Courthouse in Atlanta, the very court where Judge Vance had worked. The other was sent to the NAACP office in Jacksonville, Florida. The campaign of terror was in full swing, and the nation was on high alert. The investigation, one of the largest and most complex in FBI history, was codenamed VanPack for Vance Package Bombing. For months, investigators chased the false trail of a racist conspiracy. They investigated hate groups across the country. But the forensic evidence, or lack thereof, began to tell a different story. The bombs were too sophisticated, too meticulously clean, to be the work of a typical hate group. They were the work of a single, highly intelligent, and forensically aware individual. The investigators began to look for someone with a personal grudge against the 11th Circuit Court. They compiled a list of every person who had had a case before the court and had lost. The list was enormous. But as they sifted through the names, one stood out. Walter Leroy Moody Jr., his 1972 bomb conviction, his endless, obsessive appeals, his history of anger against the system, it all fit the profile. The FBI began a covert surveillance operation on Moody. They found that he had recently purchased the specific type of materials used in the bombs. They found a typewriter that matched the letters sent to the media. The crucial piece of evidence, however, came from Moody himself. He was a man who could not resist talking. In a recorded conversation with his ex-wife, he made a series of incriminating statements, revealing a detailed knowledge of the bomb's construction that only the killer could possess. In July of 1990, Walter Leroy Moody Jr. was arrested. His trial was a battle of wits. Moody, acting as his own co-counsel, used his legal knowledge to try and dismantle the prosecution's case. He was arrogant, defiant, and utterly convinced of his own intellectual superiority. But the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. The jury saw through his performance. In 1991, he was convicted in federal court on a host of charges related to the bombings and sentenced to 7 life terms plus 400 years. He was later tried and convicted of murder in an Alabama state court and sentenced to death. Walter Moody spent the rest of his life on death row, never admitting his guilt, never showing a flicker of remorse. He continued to file appeals, his final years a continuation of the same obsessive legal battle that had consumed his life. On April 19, 2018, at the age of 83, Walter Leroy Moody Jr. was executed by lethal injection, nearly 3 decades after his act of explosive revenge. His story is a chilling testament to the enduring power of a grudge. It is a story of a man whose intelligence and ambition were poisoned by a single, all-consuming resentment. He was a killer who used not only explosives, but also narrative as a weapon, creating a false story of racial hatred to hide a simple, personal, and cold-blooded act of revenge that had been patiently nurtured for 12 long years. Case 3. The Jilted Husband's 15-Year Obsession. A man's resentment over his divorce culminates in a brutal double murder 15 years later. Time is often seen as a healer, a force that smooths the sharp edges of grief and anger, allowing old wounds to scar over and fade into memory. But for some, time is not a healer. It is an incubator. It is a space where a grievance is not forgotten, but nurtured, where a sense of injustice is allowed to grow and fester, its roots deepening until it consumes the soul. This is the story of a man whose resentment over a lost love and a broken marriage was cultivated in silence for 15 years, a slow-burning fuse that would eventually lead to a meticulously planned and brutally executed act of revenge. The story begins in the 1980s in the affluent, manicured suburbs of Westchester County, New York. Nicholas Nick Novellino and Judith Judy Donnelly were high school sweethearts. Their life together seemed to be the picture of suburban success. Nick was a successful certified public accountant, and Judy was a devoted mother to their 3 children. They lived in a beautiful home, part of a close-knit community. But beneath the surface of this idyllic life, the marriage was crumbling. By the mid-1980s, the relationship had become strained. They divorced in 1988, and the separation was acrimonious. Nick Novellino did not handle the divorce well. He was a man of intense pride and a need for control, and the dissolution of his marriage was a profound blow to his ego. He felt that Judy had wronged him, that she had taken his children and his life away from him. This sense of being a victim, of having been unjustly cast aside, became the central, defining narrative of his life. Judy Donnelly moved on. She built a new life for herself and her children. A few years after the divorce, she began a relationship with a man named Paul Murridge. He was a kind, gentle man, a retired schoolteacher who brought a new sense of stability and happiness to her life. They eventually married, and Judy became Judith Murridge.
She was happy.
She had found a new beginning. For Nick Novellino, however, there was no new beginning. There was only the past. He remained fixated on his ex-wife and the life he had lost. For 15 years, he harbored his grudge. He lived a seemingly normal life. He remarried. He continued his successful career as an accountant. To the outside world, he was a man who had moved on. But internally, the resentment was a constant, simmering fire. He meticulously documented his perceived grievances in a series of diaries, a private ledger of every slight, real or imagined. He watched his ex-wife's new life from a distance, his anger growing with each passing year of her happiness. His children grew up, and he felt increasingly alienated from them, a feeling he blamed entirely on Judy. In the early 2000s, this long-dormant grudge began to metastasize into a concrete, homicidal plan. He began to research. He studied police procedures, forensic science, and the methods of murder. He was not planning a crime of passion. He was planning a perfect crime, an execution that would be untraceable, a final, victorious act of control over the woman he felt had ruined his life. He began to acquire the tools for his revenge.
He bought a gun.
He purchased a change of clothes, a disguise, and items he would need to clean up a crime scene. His plan was one of chilling, methodical detail. He would not just kill her. He would erase her, and he would do it in a way that would leave the police baffled. The date he chose for his revenge was Sunday, March 21st, 2004. It was a day like any other. Judith and Paul Murridge were at their home in the town of New Castle, New York. They were a quiet, retired couple, their lives a gentle routine of hobbies and time spent together. They had no idea that a ghost from a 15-year-old divorce was about to materialize at their front door. That evening, Nick Novolino put his plan into motion. He drove to a commuter parking lot, where he left his own car. He then took a taxi to a location near his ex-wife's home. He was carrying a bag containing his weapon and his kill kit. He approached the house on foot, under the cover of darkness. He confronted the couple inside their home. What exactly was said in those final moments is unknown, but the result was one of brutal, cold-blooded violence. Novolino shot his ex-wife, Judith, and her husband, Paul, multiple times. He executed them in the place where they had found their second chance at happiness. The act of murder, however, was only the first part of his meticulous plan. What followed was a strange and elaborate ritual of staging and cleanup. He moved the bodies, positioning them to suggest a different kind of crime, perhaps a robbery gone wrong. He spent a significant amount of time at the crime scene, attempting to wipe away any forensic evidence that could link him to the murders. He collected the shell casings. He cleaned surfaces. He was not a frantic killer. He was a methodical accountant, balancing the books of his own crime. When he was finished, he left the house and walked away into the night. He disposed of the weapon and the other items from his kit. He returned to his car and drove home, back to his new life, his new wife, believing he had committed the perfect, untraceable act of revenge. He had finally, in his own twisted mind, settled the score. The bodies of Judith and Paul Murridge were discovered the next day by a concerned relative. The police arrived to a scene that was both brutal and perplexing. It was clearly a double homicide, but the staging was unusual. The lack of forced entry suggested the killer was someone the victims knew. The investigation immediately focused on those closest to the couple, and the name of the ex-husband, Nick Novolino, quickly rose to the top of the list. The acrimonious divorce, the long-standing resentment, it was a classic motive. But motive alone is not evidence. The crime scene had been wiped. There was no murder weapon. Novolino had a seemingly solid alibi. He claimed he had been home with his wife. The investigators were tenacious. They began to piece together the timeline of Novolino's movements on the day of the murder. They checked his phone records, his computer history. The crucial break in the case came from a simple, modern piece of technology, a GPS device. The taxi that Novolino had taken from the parking lot to his ex-wife's neighborhood was equipped with a GPS tracker. The records provided a digital breadcrumb trail that completely destroyed his alibi. They placed him at the scene of the crime, at the time of the murders. They also found evidence on his home computer. He had conducted internet searches on topics like how to commit the perfect murder and how to clean up a crime scene. He had researched gunshot wounds and police investigation techniques. His computer was a digital diary of his murderous obsession. In the face of this overwhelming technological evidence, his story collapsed. Nick Novolino, the man who had planned his revenge for 15 years, had been undone by a satellite. He was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. At his trial, the prosecution presented the story of a man consumed by a cold, obsessive rage. They detailed the years of resentment, the meticulous planning, and the brutal execution. The diaries he had kept were presented as evidence, a chilling, decades-long record of his festering hatred. Novolino's defense was a desperate, last-ditch effort. He claimed that he had gone to the house only to confront his ex-wife, and that an argument had escalated, leading to a struggle in which the gun had gone off accidentally. The jury did not believe him. The evidence of premeditation was too strong. The 2 gunshots to each victim were not an accident. They were an execution. In 2006, Nicholas Novolino was found guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The story of Nick Novolino is a chilling testament to the corrosive power of a grudge. It is a story about how a sense of victimhood, when nurtured by a narcissistic and unforgiving mind, can lie dormant for years, a sleeping monster that can awaken with devastating violence. Judith and Paul Murridge were not killed because of something they had done recently. They were killed by a memory, by a ghost from a long-ago divorce who refused to fade away. Their deaths are a profound and tragic reminder that for some, time does not heal all wounds. It only gives them more time to plan their revenge. Case 4. The Dixie Mafia's Prison Cell Plot. A crime boss, feeling wronged, orders the assassination of a judge from his prison cell. The concept of a grudge is often a personal, solitary affair, a poison that one consumes alone. But in the shadowy world of organized crime, a grudge is not just a personal matter. It is a matter of business, a question of honor and power. When a crime boss is wronged, their revenge is not a singular act, but an edict, a command that sets in motion a chain of violence. This is the story of a man whose personal vendetta against a judge reached out from behind the walls of a federal prison and culminated in a cold-blooded assassination on a quiet suburban street. The story begins on the Mississippi Gulf Coast in the 1970s and 80s, a region that was, at the time, a hotbed of vice and corruption. The dominant force in this criminal underworld was a loose-knit but powerful organization known as the Dixie Mafia. At its head was a man named Kirksey McCord, Nix Jr. Nix was not a stereotypical mob boss. He was intelligent, charismatic, and politically connected, the son of a prominent Mississippi politician. But he used his intelligence and connections to build a criminal empire based on fraud, extortion, and murder. In 1971, Nix was involved in a particularly brazen crime. He and his associates murdered a wealthy grocery store owner named Frank Corso and his wife in a plot to steal their fortune. The murder was brutal, and the investigation eventually led back to Nix. He was charged and convicted of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison at the notorious Louisiana State Penitentiary, known as Angola. For most criminals, a life sentence at Angola would be the end of the story. For Kirksey Nix, it was just a change of office. From his prison cell, he continued to run his criminal enterprises. He had access to phones, to outside contacts, and to a network of loyal, violent men who were willing to do his bidding. He became the architect of a massive Lonely Hearts scam, conning homosexual men out of their savings by promising them a relationship with a young, attractive man, a role often played by Nix himself over the phone. The scam was incredibly lucrative, netting hundreds of thousands of dollars. But it eventually drew the attention of the FBI. The investigation led them to the prison cell of Kirksey Nix. The man in charge of the federal investigation and the subsequent prosecution was a U.S. district judge named Vincent Sherry. Judge Sherry, along with his wife, Margaret, a prominent local politician who was on a crusade to clean up the corruption in Biloxi, became the public faces of the effort to dismantle the Dixie Mafia. In 1986, Kirksey Nix was indicted for his role in the Lonely Heart scam. He was furious. He saw Judge Sherry as the man responsible for this new legal assault, a man who was threatening to cut off his last remaining source of power and income. In Nix's mind, this was not just a legal proceeding, it was a personal attack. He developed a deep and abiding hatred for Judge Sherry, and from the depths of Angola, he decided to exact his revenge. The plot he set in motion was a classic contract killing, a murder for hire orchestrated from a distance. The first person Nix turned to was his lawyer, a man named Pete Hallett. Hallett was a childhood friend of both Vincent and Margaret Sherry, a man who moved in the same social and political circles. He was also, secretly, on Kirksey Nix's payroll. He was the mob boss's man on the outside. Nix instructed Hallett to find a hitman. Hallett, acting as the middleman, contacted a local Biloxi strip club owner and Dixie Mafia associate named Mike Gillick Jr. Gillick, in turn, hired a local career criminal and hitman named Thomas Holcomb. The price for the murder of a federal judge and his wife was reportedly $20,000. The plan was set. The command had been given from a prison cell, passed through a corrupt lawyer, and handed to a hired killer. On the night of September 14, 1987, the plot reached its bloody conclusion. Judge Vincent Sherry and his wife, Margaret, were at their home in Biloxi. Thomas Holcomb, the hitman, approached the house under the cover of darkness. He entered the home and, using a .22 caliber pistol equipped with a silencer, he shot both Judge Sherry and Margaret Sherry multiple times, executing them in their own living room. The murder was clinical, professional, and brutal. The assassination of a federal judge and his politically active wife sent a shockwave through the state of Mississippi and across the nation. It was a brazen assault on the justice system, a clear message from the criminal underworld. The investigation was massive and immediate, a joint effort by the FBI and local law enforcement. The initial theory was that Margaret Sherry, with her aggressive anti-corruption campaign, had been the primary target. But as investigators dug deeper, they began to unravel the complex web of the Dixie Mafia. They started to focus on the Lonely Heart scam and the man at its center, Kirksey Nix. The key to breaking the case was the money trail. The Lonely Heart scam had generated a huge amount of cash, and Nix was desperate to get his hands on it. The investigators believed that Judge Sherry's murder was not just an act of revenge, but part of a larger plot by Nix to spring himself from prison. He believed that if he could eliminate the judge and get access to his hidden fortune, he could bribe his way to freedom. The weak link in the conspiracy was the lawyer, Pete Hallett. For years, he maintained his innocence. He attended the Sherry's funeral, acting the part of the grieving friend. He even served as a pallbearer. But the investigators were suspicious. They put him under surveillance. They analyzed his financial records. They found that he had been receiving large, unexplained cash payments. The final pieces of the puzzle came from within the prison walls. Inmates who had been part of Nix's scam began to talk, trading information for lighter sentences. They detailed Nix's rage against Judge Sherry. They described the constant phone calls between Nix and his lawyer, Hallett. The conspiracy of silence was beginning to break. The most damning piece of evidence was a secret recording. The FBI managed to record a conversation between Nix and Hallett in which they discussed the murder plot. The tape captured the cold, business-like nature of their conspiracy. It was the smoking gun. In 1991, for years after the murders, the indictments came down. Kirksey Nix, Pete Hallett, Mike Gillick, and the hitman, Thomas Holcomb, were all charged with conspiracy and murder for hire. The subsequent trial was a landmark event, a public dissection of the deep-seated corruption that had plagued the Mississippi Gulf Coast for decades. The prosecution laid out the entire, cold-blooded plot for the jury. They presented the story of a crime boss's prison cell grudge, a corrupt lawyer's betrayal, and a hired killer's deadly efficiency. The star witness was the hitman, Thomas Holcomb, who agreed to testify against the others in exchange for a plea deal. He calmly recounted the details of the assassination, implicating everyone in the chain of command, from Nix down to Gillick. The jury found them all guilty. Kirksey Nix, already serving a life sentence, was given another one, ensuring he would die in prison. Pete Hallett, the trusted friend and corrupt lawyer, was sentenced to 18 years. Mike Gillick also received a lengthy sentence. The Dixie Mafia's grip on Biloxi had been broken. The story of the Sherry murders is a chilling example of how a grudge, when held by a man with power and reach, can become a weapon of terrifying force. Kirksey Nix's revenge was not the act of a lone, obsessed individual. It was a corporate decision, an assassination ordered from a prison office and carried out by a network of subordinates. The murders of Vincent and Margaret Sherry were a tragic testament to the price of integrity in a corrupt world, and a stark reminder that even the thickest prison walls cannot always contain the murderous reach of a grudge held by a kingpin. Case 5. The Killdozers' Fortified Rampage. A man wronged by his town council secretly armors a bulldozer for a revenge plot. A grudge is, at its core, a story of powerlessness. It is the feeling of being wronged by a force larger than oneself, a system that is perceived as unjust and unmovable. For most, this feeling leads to resignation or quiet resentment. But for a man named Marvin Heemeyer, a welder and muffler shop owner in the small mountain town of Granby, Colorado, this feeling of powerlessness would be transformed, through years of meticulous, secret labor, into an unstoppable, armored force of pure, destructive revenge. Marvin Heemeyer was a man who, by all accounts, was a reasonable and hard-working member of his community. He owned a small muffler repair shop, a business he had built himself. He was known for his skill as a welder. He was also a man with a deep-seated belief in what was right, a man who would not back down from a fight if he felt he had been wronged. The grudge that would consume him began with a simple zoning dispute. In the late 1990s, a concrete company sought to build a new plant on the property adjacent to Heemeyer's muffler shop. Heemeyer fiercely opposed the plan. He argued that the new plant would block the only access road to his business, effectively destroying his livelihood. He began a long and frustrating battle with the Granby Town Council. He filed petitions, he attended town meetings, he pleaded his case. He saw it as a straightforward issue of fairness. But the town council, swayed by the economic benefits of the new plant, sided with the concrete company. The zoning change was approved. The plant was built. And just as he had predicted, Marvin Heemeyer's access road was cut off. His business began to fail. He felt betrayed, not just by the concrete company, but by his own town, by the very system of local government that was supposed to protect the rights of the small businessman. He tried to fight back. He sued the town. He attempted to get permission to build a new road. Every effort was met with bureaucratic roadblocks and legal defeats. His frustration grew into a profound and bitter resentment. He saw a conspiracy, a good old boy, network of corrupt town officials and powerful business interests aligned against him. He felt he had exhausted every legal and peaceful avenue. The system, he concluded, was rigged. It was at this point that Marvin Heemeyer's grudge began its transformation from a legal battle into a secret, military-grade construction project. In 2002, He sold his muffler shop property to the concrete company, but he was given 6 months to vacate. In that time, he moved a large Komatsu D355A bulldozer into the now empty shop. And in the secrecy of that garage, he began to build his instrument of revenge. For a year and a half, Heemeyer worked in complete isolation. He used his formidable skills as a welder to encase the bulldozer in a shell of homemade composite armor. He layered thick plates of steel with a core of concrete, creating a nearly impenetrable fortress on treads. The armor was over a foot thick in some places. He mounted .50 caliber and .308 caliber rifles in armored ports. He installed video cameras, protected by bulletproof plastic, and linked them to monitors inside the cab, creating a makeshift periscope system, as there were no windows. He installed air conditioning and a ventilation system. He was not just modifying a bulldozer. He was building a tank, a land battleship, an urban assault vehicle. He called it the MK tank, but the world would come to know it as the Killdozer. While he worked, he made a series of audio tapes, a manifesto explaining his motivations. On the tapes, he calmly details his grievances with the town council, the concrete plant, and anyone else he felt had wronged him. He refers to his plan as his project. He speaks of God, believing that he was on a divine mission to punish the wicked. "I was always willing to be reasonable until I had to be unreasonable," he says on one tape. Sometimes reasonable men must do unreasonable things. On the morning of June 4th, 2004, Marvin Heemeyer decided it was time to be unreasonable. He sealed himself inside his armored creation. There was no way out. This was a one-way trip. He used a crane he had built inside the garage to lower the final, armored shell over the cab, entombing himself inside. He then started the engine and drove his 60-ton fortress of rage straight through the wall of his muffler shop and into the sunlight. The town of Granby was about to face a reckoning. His rampage was not random. It was a meticulously planned tour of destruction. His targets were the physical manifestations of his grudge. He first drove to the concrete plant, the source of his original dispute, and systematically demolished it, flattening building after building as if they were made of cardboard. From there, he moved on to the town hall. The local police, armed only with pistols and shotguns, could do nothing. Their bullets ricocheted harmlessly off the thick armor. Heemeyer was invincible. He drove his machine straight through the town hall, reducing it to a pile of rubble. He then targeted the home of a former mayor, a man who had sat on the council that had approved the plant. He targeted the local newspaper office, which he felt had slandered him. He targeted the bank that had been involved in his foreclosure. He targeted businesses owned by other members of the town council. One by one, he erased the symbols of the system that he believed had destroyed him. The scene in Granby was one of surreal, slow-motion chaos. The Killdozer moved at a deliberate, unstoppable pace, impervious to anything the police could throw at it. A SWAT team was called in. They fired hundreds of rounds at the machine, to no effect. They tried to use explosives, which also failed to penetrate the armor. Heemeyer, sealed inside his cockpit, watched the world through his cameras and continued his methodical destruction, occasionally firing his rifles at power transformers and propane tanks. For over 2 hours, Marvin Heemeyer held his town hostage. He destroyed 13 buildings, causing millions of dollars in damage. Miraculously, and perhaps by his own design, no one other than Heemeyer himself was killed or injured. His rage was directed not at people but at property, at the buildings that represented his years of frustration. The rampage finally came to an end not because of police action, but because of a mechanical failure. As Heemeyer was attempting to demolish a local hardware store, the bulldozer's engine began to overheat. The machine became bogged down in the basement of the ruined building, its radiator damaged, its tread stuck. The killdozer was finally immobilized. As police and SWAT teams surrounded the silent, steaming machine, they heard a single, muffled gunshot from within the cab. Marvin Heemeyer had taken his own life. It took authorities over 12 hours to cut through the armor and reach his body. Inside, they found a man who had successfully waged a one-man war against his own community. The story of Marvin Heemeyer and the killdozer is a uniquely American tale of a grudge that escalated into a spectacular, destructive rebellion. He was a man who felt he had been left with no voice, so he built one out of steel and concrete. His rampage was not an act of madness in the clinical sense. It was the final, logical step in a long, rationalized process of grievance. He was a man who, having failed to move the system with his words, decided to move it with a bulldozer, leaving behind a legacy of destruction that stands as a powerful and terrifying monument to a grudge that refused to be ignored. A grudge is a patient poison. It can lie dormant for years, a quiet ember of resentment that slowly consumes the soul. When it finally ignites, the resulting fire is not one of sudden passion, but of cold, calculated fury. The stories we have heard tonight are testaments to the enduring power of memory when it is yoked to a sense of injustice. They remind us that the most devastating acts of revenge are often not those born of a fleeting moment of anger, but those that are carefully planned, meticulously executed, and served ice-cold, years after the original wound was inflicted. Thank you for joining us at the Crime Folio. Sleep well and stay safe.